I'm really looking forward to this particular webinar because I've always been really fascinated in the development of high streets and their changing face. So a few years ago, I was the archivist for Marks and Spencer's, and we had an incredible collection of photos of all the M&S stores throughout the 20th century. So that was effectively photos of every high street in the country across that whole 100 years. It was really amazing just to flick through those, because those photos really showed that the high street never stands still. Every single decade is a decade of change, and the appearance and who's on the high street and how it's configured changes totally. So it's a bit of a well-worn cliche that we live in a rapidly changing world, and we're hearing increasingly how much the pandemic has accelerated that pace of change. But it is a cliche that holds a lot of truth. And I think the pace of change is nowhere as visible as on our high streets. So in some places, we're now painfully aware of those, what's sometimes described as gaps in the smile of the high street, those empty shops where famous household names used to be. But at the same time, there are some other streets that are absolutely buzzing because we've all shifted to live, work and shop locally. So today, we're going to explore what this means for libraries. And we were keen to run this event now because we're at this pivotal point as we emerge from the pandemic. And I know that many of you are thinking about the configuration of your buildings and services in the short, medium and long term. How can you ensure that your buildings do reopen after the prolonged closure? And are your buildings in the right place for people's new patterns of life? How do you distribute your services in different locations? These were really pressing questions. And I think the challenge for libraries, when we're thinking about buildings, sometimes that means it's a long-term development proposal to move a library or rebuild it or change where it is. So it's long-term planning, but we're still in an environment that remains very uncertain, and it can sometimes feel very difficult to even think about planning for 6 months ahead, never mind thinking about a 3, 4, 5-year program. But today we're going to take a deep dive into the subject. So we'll look at some of the key questions, including what is happening on our high streets? Does this vary between different types of high streets? What changes are here to stay? And what are the long-term trends? How do libraries relate to high streets? What's that interrelationship all about? And what challenges and opportunities do the changes present for us? So I'm really pleased today that we're joined by 3 expert speakers. So they'll each speak for 10 or 15 minutes because we want to leave loads of time at the end for discussion. I'm really sorry that I've got to slip out of the event just before 2 because I've unfortunately got another event I've got to go to. So at that point, my colleague Ian Moore will take over and host the Q&A session, and I'll look forward to catching up on the recording later on. I'm really interested to hear what you all think. So our first speaker today is Dave Rowe. And Dave, I'm sure, is known to many of you, especially those of you on Twitter, as Libraries Hacked. And Dave is the absolute king of library statistics and someone who is never happier than when playing with statistics and really fantastically showing what the power of stats is, how they can really help us have a lens to look into how libraries are performing and to really think about the future. So Dave, over to you. Dave's going to talk about some really interesting work he's been doing looking at library locations on high streets.
Great, thank you very much. And I will just share my screen. And do let me know if you can't see it or can't hear me. But just a quick introduction, so that was very generous by Isabel. So I'm a geospatial software developer. That tends to mean doing things with maps in kind of plain terms. So my background there, I've got a map which I'll be exploring in a moment. But I'm also very keen on library data in an enthusiast level as well as a professional level. So any data I can get hold of on libraries, I'm keen to get hold of and look at the kind of location element of that data. So whether or not it's analyzing locations of static libraries or mobile libraries or anything that kind of has a location element to it. So it might be the addresses of memberships, for example. So there's another project I'm involved in, which is about mapping membership data and looking at some of the kind of insights we can get from that in terms of deprivation and kind of small areas, and seeing where we have high membership and where we have low membership. But with high streets, it's been something I've been really interested in for a long time, because high streets are often mentioned in association with libraries. And I've put a couple of quotes here, which I've found completely at random from Twitter, and with a kind of quote that are really positive in sentiment, are inspirational, but I always had a bit of unease about, because I always felt we didn't really have the data to kind of back up some of the things we were saying, or that we didn't have the basic data to kind of even understand what the implications were. So the examples here, for example, libraries are the universities of the streets. There should be one on every high street. I perfectly agree with that comment, but what do we mean by every high street? Do we know how many numbers that is, for example, in England? It could be 10,000, it could be 1,000. We could be talking about either dropping numbers of libraries or increasing them to a huge extent. Similarly, libraries are part of the civic glue that hold our high streets and town centres together. But one thing I wanted to understand was how many libraries really are uniquely tied to a high street. How many are kind of maybe in more, maybe less high street areas, and what are the impact of those libraries? Because we can't talk about libraries just about in terms of high streets. So to go back to basics, one thing that happened, which was a real breakthrough in this area, was in 2019, Ordnance Survey defined and mapped all the high streets in Great Britain. They did that using a data definition of a high street, and I've got a picture there which illustrates one particular high street, which is in Corsham, where I used to live, and it's a relatively small town. But simply based upon number of retail locations and kind of how those locations were clustered, and obviously the requirement to have a street, Ordnance Survey were able to map all the high streets in Great Britain and actually identify all the high street buildings. And what that meant was, alongside that, they could say what the building types were, so they could get a good mix of, say, retail, residential, commercial buildings, really understand how our high streets were made up in terms of the buildings, but also start to look at trends. So they've been kind of doing this on a yearly basis, so starting to look at how those maybe building mix is changing. So if you're getting more commercial buildings within high streets, they'll be able to see that and see it on an individual high street level. And they've been working with the Office for National Statistics to really look at those trends. One thing to mention, this data is fully available to anyone who's a public sector organisation. So through the public sector mapping agreement with Ordnance Survey, any public sector organisation can get hold of this data. I personally got hold of it through the DCMS. The DCMS were good enough to provide me with the data through the mapping contractor agreement, which meant I could take the data. And the thing I then wanted to do was to look at high streets alongside library locations. So we had some fairly basic data on high street libraries in England. And there was a few things I wanted to do with that. And let me just hide this. I've got a window on top. So I wanted to firstly analyze locations of all libraries in England. I'll talk about some of the findings from that. I also wanted to understand a bit more about this definition of high street. So I've got an image here which is showing the centre of Gloucester, and you might not be able to see the particular level of detail, but it effectively has 4 high streets coming out of the centre, and actually then some further side streets further on, which within the OS definition are all defined as high streets. Now that's a fairly natural thing, because they're using data. They can only take a single street and analyse it. And so it amounts to some city centres which might have 5 or 6 high streets. No, I don't think that's a particular thing that people identify with. I certainly wouldn't say if I'm going to Gloucester High Street that I'm going to 6 high streets. I'd probably just think of one, maybe Gloucester Centre or one high street destination. And when we look back at those quotes, saying things like, well, we should have a library on every high street. Well, you obviously wouldn't have a library within each one of these streets, because they're all within, a few minutes of each other. So I started off by actually creating a kind of new definition of a high street destination, which actually clustered these together. So within the context of Gloucester, this would be one single destination based upon the fact of just looking at the location of the high streets and whether or not they're close enough to each other to kind of cluster them. And that was important to the analysis, which I'll get into in a moment. So in having that further definition, I was able to count the number of libraries that were on a high street definition and destination. So what I mean by that is that the building is actually part of the high street. So it's, you know, one of these buildings, for example, that is highlighted, and literally, if you're walking along the high street, you know, the library will be one of those buildings. I also counted the number of libraries which were near to a high street destination. So if we look at this example here, we have Gloucester Library, which is actually, it's about 70 meters from the relevant high street, which is Eastgate Street. But because it's only within maybe a couple of minutes walk, I took a 5-minute walking distance to define Gloucester Library, and in fact any libraries within England, as being near to a high street. So I'll take a quick look at my findings. Firstly, I should say that by looking at actually just the location of libraries, there was a couple of interesting things. There are some other statistics available which describe the rurality of any location in England. So whether it's a classification on how rural or urban it is. Now, one thing I noticed from library data was that libraries are in all of those classifications. So from the most kind of rural area of hamlets, you know, with a sparse setting, to kind of major conurbations, libraries are present in all those different types of areas. And this wasn't the case of, say, retail locations. One in particular I looked at was Waterstones, which are all in rural areas for kind of obvious reasons. But it separated libraries out from those different locations to say, well, we're not the same as a retail outlet, or we're not the same as a Waterstones or a coffee shop, or whatever it might be. We are spread across the country in all different types of areas. What I also found was that libraries are in all areas in terms of deprivation indices. So many people will know that there's areas have classifications in terms of deprivation, which will look at the health, crime, education levels within those areas. Libraries are almost equally spread across all those indices. So from the least deprived areas to the most deprived areas, it's pretty much an equal split. And that I found quite interesting, because again, it's looking at equitable access rather than kind of a strategic location within high streets or other retail locations. But at a high level, it was interesting to see that 25% of the libraries were actually on high streets, so a relatively low amount. And when I compared this to, say, Waterstones, they were more in the kind of 80% area, whereas libraries are not really located, or a quarter of libraries are located directly on high streets, but by no means the majority. 65% were near to high streets, so that's the 5-minute walking distance. So still a lot, but not, you know, not really loads and loads of libraries, you know, maybe more like half. And then the other interesting thing I found was that despite that, which might kind of give the impression that libraries are maybe less tied to the high street, it was actually the case that over half of high street destinations did have an associated library. And the interesting thing I found about that was that libraries themselves are have a kind of quite a powerful strategic location, in that they're all over the country. They're in all kinds of rural, urban areas, all kinds of deprivation of areas. But there's still a really significant presence on the high street. So they're kind of almost like to say the high streets need libraries more than libraries need the high street. Libraries aren't particularly tied to high streets, or they could be anywhere, but there's still a real significant presence on high streets. And then I had a few recommendations of where to go from here. So this was a really high level look at libraries in England. So from their services, individual services could make use of the OS and ONS high street dataset and really look at their own individual libraries, merge that with kind of, you know, the intelligence that's going on with those high streets, and kind of look at how that relates to maybe their libraries that are on particular high streets. One thing I'd really like to see would be enhanced library data on things like footfall. So looking at how, you know, we can combine data that we have on footfall of libraries, and how we can mix that with, say, the relevant data within the high streets. So say, can we see patterns throughout the day that are similar with a library as to the shops maybe it's next to? And that would obviously involve also working with local businesses, maybe to share their data and merge this all into a single business intelligence data set. And I think I've had about 10 minutes or just about, so that's me done.
Great, thank you, Dave. That's really fascinating. And I think, as ever, you're really showing the power of data and the possibilities that come when we start to look at it. And I love that phrase you have about libraries have an important strategic presence. It really is fascinating to see how widespread they are and that really, really close relationship to the high street.
Yeah. No, definitely, I agree. And yeah, and essentially, I think libraries need to consider both their position, as I say, widely in across the whole country, and but they still have that significant presence on the high street, which is really powerful as well.
And I think some of the suggestions you've got about, really drilling into, for example, understanding your hourly footfall and how those ebb and flow throughout the day, how that matches to retail's ebb and flow is really fascinating, because I presume there's a lot of retail businesses that will be tracking that kind of thing, because that's what determines all sorts of things, from when supplies are delivered to what the opening hours and staffing are. So yeah, really fascinating
definitely.
stuff.
And I know there's plenty of areas and cities and towns that have the business improvement districts, which you can link in with, that will have data. It might not be open, it might be restricted to kind of their members or whatever it might be, but I'm sure there's potential for sharing there, where they will be interested in people coming to the library, and maybe other public information that can be gained by the library, like car park occupancy and things like that, are all available within the local authority. So yeah, a lot of opportunity for mixing data between the businesses on the high street and obviously the local authority that manage the library and other locations within the town and city.
Brilliant, thank you. So it's really, really powerful tools that are out there to be used. I'm now going to invite my colleague Ian Moore to speak. So Ian's been having a look at some of the fantastically rich data that's being shared through the High Street Task Force. And what they've been really closely doing over the last year or so, of course, is monitoring the impact of the pandemic and lockdown on high streets, and also looking at different types of high streets, and what are the long and short-term trends, what's here to stay, and what's changing. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Dave. It's excellent to see kind of really deep dives into the data around libraries, and I think one of the things that we keep coming up with, and I think which is quite evident from what I'm going to be talking about as well, is that we don't have as good a sense of data and sense of activity in the library sector as we'd like, and particularly we don't have it as integrated with other things as well as we'd like. So rather than being able to present an integrated picture of what's happening on the high street and the libraries, what we're able to do is present data alongside each other. So this is what's happening on the high street, this is what's happening on the libraries, rather than being able to really kind of interrogate how they interrelate. But that is something I'm really, really keen to work, hopefully with Dave in future on, to try and shift that forward and kind of really sort of improve that. So High Street Task Force has been working with Institute of Place Management to commission an organisation called Springboard, which has been basically since the start of the pandemic putting together benchmarks of high street activity and high street footfall, all benchmarked against an average for 2019, to see how the pandemic has impacted on high street footfall. And we can kind of see sort of from the start of the pandemic, obviously a massive drop initially, and then throughout most of last summer, well, throughout lockdown 1, a gentle increase to around 25% in June of last year of 2019's footfall. Over summer last year, coming up to and plateauing at a peak of around 60 to 70% of the previous year's footfall, but then dropping back down a little bit in November's sort of lockdown, and then dropping that down more fully in the January 2021 lockdown coming up. And then we're seeing it really kind of starting to reopen again in April this year, after April the 12th. But again, kind of just going up to that level of around 60 to 70% of previous footfall. So when we look at that in terms of the different areas, different types of areas, we're seeing a very different picture across the country. So central London, essentially the drop's been nearly 60%, regional cities nearly 50%, historic towns, 45%, but then outer London, market towns, coastal towns are less than 40% drop. And the interpretation that High Street Task Force have put on this is really kind of that rise in localism that Isabel and Dave were both talking about, where people are not traveling into cities to do their shopping, not traveling into cities to visit a major city library and going to their local library, not traveling into cultural activities and hospitality activities as well. So really kind of that increase in the importance of local towns or local high streets within major cities, so like outer London, but also in terms of the towns that make up the majority of Greater Manchester, for example, those kind of things where people are staying much closer to home. And I think that provides a lot of opportunities for libraries, particularly the branch libraries, and how we rebalance the library, how we rebalance the service across different libraries. So looking at our own stats about physical activity in libraries, so this is from July last year coming up to April this year. We've got two lines on here, and it's a percentage of the average for 2019, essentially. The top line is the number of sites open, so the percentage of library sites in each library service that's open. So that went down. At its worst, it's been sort of around 40%, and then 60% in this last lockdown, being able to maintain services in some sites. The blue line on the bottom is the percentage of footfall. So the footfall as a percentage of the previous years. So we've seen after the first lockdown, we've really struggled to build that back up. So we've struggled to build it back up to more than about 20%. And that was the peak in October last year. We're currently back at, and this is just physical footfall in the building. This isn't about the services that our libraries are providing, but we're currently back up at around just over 10% of the previous physical footfall. This is for April. So some of the reopening that's happened throughout April and then into May won't feature into this. So we're expecting, we can see over the last 2 months, there's been a start of an increase, and we expect that increase to really quite significantly accelerate when we get the May and June figures in, just as shops, retail and other activities have more widely reopened. But that's not the only activities within the libraries. I mean, there's a huge amount of digital activity, huge amount of activity that's shifted online. And there's also the mobile libraries, the libraries at home, where people are delivering either by post or often by staff cars and things like that. Lots of different mechanisms to get books to people and to provide access to other services. And we also find as the delivery of books has shifted from that physical coming into the library and getting them, the proportion of the activity that this footfall represents is much higher in terms of the specific activities like direct access to PCs, supported, those kind of digital assisted services, the ones where people are coming into the libraries because there isn't any way to get that outside as well. Looking as well at the town and high street, the High Street Task Force data, the way they've structured it is they've broken everything down into 4 different categories of town and high street. And I think it's probably useful for libraries to start to understand where their libraries fit, or where their towns and high streets fit within that. So there's 4 different ones. There's holiday towns, which are obviously busy in summer, quiet in winter, and they give a good experience to visitors in the summer, and they don't so much focus on providing an experience to local people who live there. So attractive to tourists, but have a relatively weak comparison offer. The comparison offer in this sense is about people being able to go and look at different shops and see what's available, and see what's available at different prices or different types of things. Then you've got specialty towns, which are busier after Easter, peak in the summer, and then have a little bit of a peak before Christmas. And the anchors to those towns are not retail, they're kind of the things like heritage and culture. So that could be somewhere like, I don't know Salisbury at all, but I suspect Salisbury's got a huge cathedral. It might form as a specialty town. And they attract visitors, but also serve the local population. So they're kind of the sort of in between holiday towns and the others. Then you've got multifunctional towns, which fairly flat throughout the year. It's a retail offer that is focused on the local community, and the anchors there are about work, shopping, and they're organized as community hubs. So they're kind of essentially kind of fairly self-contained towns that serve the local community, and they don't necessarily draw people in, but also they don't require their local residents to go elsewhere as well. And then comparison towns are those where there's a peak in footfall leading up to Christmas, and that's essentially places where people would go. The retail choice, leisure, food and drink and things like that are very strong. There's a very broad range of it, and there's often international brands there as well. And people travel into those towns to be able to look for alternative things, the stuff that they can't normally get in their local town, whether it could be any of the others, but there's not necessarily the access to the same level of range, the same range of services that are available. And then what we're seeing over the last year, the impact has been very different in the different towns. So holiday towns, this is the April report from High Street Task Force, I'll say, because holiday towns footfall was down 38.5% compared to last year, and then down 0.8 compared to the same day last week. If we did this now, that would obviously be very different, as anyone who has tried to have a holiday abroad a holiday in England in the last few weeks will be well aware. And for example, a good example of holiday towns would be most towns in Cornwall, and there will just be, I think, it's not going to be down 0.8%. They'll be manic at the moment, I think. Specialty towns down a little bit more, but up 13% compared to the same day last year. So it feels as though sort of like, well, while they're down compared to the last year, they've started to recover much faster than the holiday towns, bearing in mind this is from April as well. Multifunctional towns dropped less than any of the others, so 38.4% down, and also 6% up compared to the previous week as well. So they're on an upward trend and they haven't had the same drop. And again, that kind of, because the multifunctional towns are the ones where essentially they're providing that local service in terms of work, activities, cultural activities, leisure activities, they're able to meet the needs locally, and kind of reflects that that rise in localism as well. And then comparison towns, footfall down 45%, so a big jump, whereas because people will be traveling to go there, a big drop from the previous year, but starting to pick up again as well. So I think it's really kind of useful for libraries to start to understand where their towns, and recognizing obviously that there might be lots of different types of these towns within a single library service as well, but where the towns within their library service fit, where the libraries line up with that, and whether the specific offer from that library is aligned with those needs as well. And then just more broadly as well, we know the impact on the high street has obviously been huge, and some of the longer term trends have really accelerated. We've seen a massive shift to online retail sales, going up now. Nearly a third of retail sales are online. What we're not seeing this really as is, this is a huge shift since the pandemic began. It's actually just an acceleration of a trend that was going on already. So we're seeing basically from 2006 all the way up to 2019, we've gone from about 2% of online retail sales being online up to just over 20%. And then the pandemic has accelerated that and taken it to over 30%. But it's not something new. It's more just something that's been brought forward by a decade, say. And similarly, things like the use of cashless technologies and things like that, and contactless, cashless technology and things like that has been accelerated by about 2 or 3 years as well, according to the High Street Task Force as of last year. And I suspect that will have shifted even further as we've gone through and really accommodated kind of the restrictions around COVID. We're then seeing those similar lending patterns in libraries. So I'm sorry, this is a little bit complicated to just look at straight away, but essentially what we've got, each of the columns is a single month, and then it's broken down by, it's the average number of items borrowed per library. Red and green at the top are physical items, and blue and yellow, blue and orange at the bottom are digital items. So we see running up to the pandemic, on the left-hand side, we're seeing the year before. So that's going from October 2019 up to April 2020. Ignore the actual labels on it. Going up to April 2020. So we're seeing that slow rise in the proportion of digital activity in terms of library lending. We obviously see from October 2020 to April, on the right-hand side, April 2021, a completely different picture where physical borrowing has dropped hugely, and we expect that to pick back up. But it's currently at around a third of what it was previously the year before. But digital continues to increase. Not only has it jumped quite significantly when the pandemic started, but it's also continuing to increase as that trend accelerates really as well. So then kind of more widely as well, we've got a number of key trends that the High Street Task Force has highlighted, sort of that shift online, that shift to cashless, and these are trends that are accelerating rather than trends that are necessarily new. That increased localism, so towns recovering faster than city centres, but then also the impact of the loss of anchor stores. And I did know someone in the chat mentioned before the impact of losing a Marks and Spencer's. Sam Elliott, who's going to be talking from Bolton in a minute, has significant experience of this in Bolton, where they lost a number, about 5 years ago, they lost a number of kind of really big anchor stores around about the same time. But then also that shift from high streets being a retail experience to being a cultural and hospitality experience. As there's a shift to online retail, there's less of a need for a physical retail presence. And so that retail presence is still there, but that the proportion of a high street and the proportion of a town centre that caters to that retail experience might shift, so that there's going to be more opportunities for culture and hospitality. And linking that with the increased localism and the loss of anchor stores, it might be that there's a lot of potentially new organisations and new businesses starting up, and the kind of SMEs that would fill in that gap where anchor stores have gone, but there's an increased need for cultural activity, increased need for leisure activities. And how do we as libraries, using things like the business and IP centres or other ways that libraries sort of incubate and innovate sort of startup organisations and support SMEs, how do we make sure that we are able to provide the platforms for them to do that as well? And in turn, just quickly responding to some of those questions in the chat about sort of university town and a specialty town, possibly, and then what type of town is ours, and then that shift of experience from retail to cultural. There's a huge amount of resources around the High Street Task Force, both on their website and the Institute of Place Management. So I'll put together some links around that and then share that with everyone who's attended, and make sure that that's available on the Income Generation Network, and potentially make sure that we can find a way to get it more widely accessible as well, just with following Dave's kind of impetus on open data and sharing knowledge as well. So thank you.
Is that, sorry, thank you. Is that you done? Sorry. It really is fascinating. And just to echo what Ian was saying, the data and insights from the High Street Task Force and their associated bodies are phenomenal. And it is presented really clearly. They even have really easy to watch videos where there are people talking you through it. So it's really worth watching and informative and entertaining. So yeah, absolutely look at that. And Ian, thank you, because I think the way that you, you know, a bit like Dave, pulled together two sets of data in ways that really help illuminate what's happening specifically for libraries. That's really, really helpful. So thank you very much. So I'm now going to introduce our third speaker, who's Tom Kelsey from the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge. Now, we were really excited when we found out about the work of the Bennett Institute. So they've been doing a lot of work recently exploring the whole very hot topic of levelling up, and looking in more detail about the fact that it's not just about building physical infrastructure, such as transport and buildings, but also really, really importantly is the social infrastructure. So this is a really, really important thing that needs thinking about with the high street. The high street isn't just bricks and mortar. It is also about the people who live and work there, and the communities that operate and rely on and grow that high street. So the Bennett Institute's work is really interesting in that regard, really sort of injecting that into the whole discussion about levelling up. And even more excitingly, when I read Tom's recent report and did a quick word search, libraries appeared 79 times as examples of social infrastructure or vital social infrastructure. And that just blew me out of the water. Far more mentions of libraries than any other form of institution or organisation out there on a high street. So we're really, really delighted to invite Tom to speak, and hopefully to again encourage all of you to read that report, which is again another really easy, entertaining and informative read.
Thanks very much, Isabel. That was a very nice introduction, and thanks also to the previous speakers. I love to hear all this stuff about the data because it speaks very closely to a lot of the concerns and some of the work we've been doing at the Bennett Institute around social infrastructure. So yeah, as Isabel said, my name's Tom Kelsey. I'm a research assistant at the Bennett Institute, which is a sort of an academic policy research institute at Cambridge. And one of our programs of research currently focuses on understanding spatial inequalities, particularly across towns in the UK, within the context, as Isabel said, of firstly the levelling up agenda, but also the post-COVID recovery agendas. And so as part of that research program, where previous reports have tried to describe variation in economic and social outcomes in towns, we recently published a report that is the first in the series to look at what can be done about tackling some of those spatial inequalities, and specifically what is the role of community facilities and social spaces like libraries or community centres or pubs or sports clubs, which collectively we refer to as social infrastructure. What is the role of those institutions in helping to drive prosperity in towns across the UK? And the report is focused on social infrastructure generally. So we look at all kinds of different facilities. We look at sports clubs, we look at museums, we look at community centres. But as Isabel said, we have this prominent and largely unintentional focus on libraries. We didn't set out to talk quite as much about libraries as we ended up doing. But part of the reason that libraries crop up over and over again in the report is because they perfectly encapsulate lots of the different ways in which social infrastructure can create value, not just for local communities, but for regional economies and for the country as a whole. So I thought what I would do here is if I just give a brief summary of the report writ large and talk about the value of social infrastructure as a whole, not just in terms of how it can help revitalise high streets, although we do have a section on that, but also more widely. And in that summary, I'll try to bring out some of the key points about libraries specifically. So the report begins with this observation that historically and today as well, British public policy has involved this, or sort of demonstrated this ingrained tendency to think about tackling spatial inequalities in terms of investing, as Isabel said, in physical infrastructure projects. And so when we listen to debates today about levelling up, we often hear conversations about the importance of investing in 5G networks or new dual carriageways or investing in high-speed rail. But in our view, on the basis of the research we've done, investing in the social infrastructure of towns, in the places, the physical spaces which allow communities to come together and build meaningful relationships, investing in that kind of infrastructure is often as important, if not in some instances more important, than investing in large-scale physical infrastructure. And in making that case, what we tried to do is to articulate 3 different types of value that social infrastructure, including libraries and leisure centres and so on, creates. The first of which is economic value. And I think this is, in some sense, actually one of the less well appreciated dimensions of value that places like libraries and other forms of social infrastructure create. We show that one of the key economic benefits of these kinds of facilities has to do with their contribution to employment. So we estimate that about 2.3 million people are employed in social infrastructure related industries across the UK. Using the ONS data that we looked at, I think it's about 50,000 people in libraries and archive activities. But what matters crucially isn't just the sheer number of people that are employed, it's also about who benefits from those employment opportunities. And what we show is that groups who are often less likely, or groups that find it more difficult to gain a foothold in the labour market, like young people or people with disabilities, are often overrepresented in jobs within social infrastructure, within pubs and restaurants, within sports clubs, within museums and libraries and art galleries and so on. And so there's a vital role for these kinds of facilities in the context of levelling up in providing employment opportunities for those that might otherwise struggle either to gain a foothold or to progress within the workforce. The second economic argument we make, which is the most relevant to this discussion, has to do with the role of social infrastructure in revitalizing high streets. And so, as Ian indicated, we know that high streets face quite severe pressures from multiple directions. The rise of online retail graph was, I wish I'd have seen that graph when I was doing this report, but the rise of online retail is one. The proliferation of out-of-town retail parks is another one, and COVID obviously is the most recent pressure that high streets are facing. And I'm really pleased that Ian brought up the High Streets Task Force classification of town centres, because one of the things that has come out of their research is not only that footfall in multifunctional town centres, which integrate cultural institutions and hospitality venues, green space, play areas, alongside traditional retail, it's not only that multifunctional towns have witnessed a slightly less acute decline in footfall during the pandemic, it's also the view of the High Streets Task Force that those sorts of towns will potentially bounce back more quickly, precisely because these kinds of institutions, including libraries, including art galleries and cafes and so on, will provide an incentive for footfall to re-enter into town centres at a time when online retail is making it increasingly convenient to do retail shopping from your bedroom. And then the second thing I just say on high streets is that it's not only about footfall, there's also some really interesting evidence about the effect that these kinds of anchor institutions have in stimulating spending in the local economy. So it's not just that they draw people in, it's that once they've drawn people in, those people go to other businesses in the local area and spend. So museums, as an example of that, independent museums attract visitor spending worth about £440 million a year. But of that, £290 million, which is equivalent to almost 5,500 full-time jobs, is spent away from the museum in other local businesses in the high street and in the town centre. So there are these crucial economic roles for social infrastructure, including libraries, to play in the high street. But I think the area of the report where high streets probably, 60 out of the 79 references to high streets probably appear in our report in this section on skills and innovation. This is where I think libraries really come into their own in economic terms. The relationship between libraries and innovation is really interesting, and there's an excellent paper which I encourage everybody to go and look up by Burks and Nenke, who are two American scholars, that have investigated the historical relationship between libraries and innovation in American towns. And what they do, they have this really innovative approach where they look at two sets of US towns in the early 20th century, towns which received a grant for a Carnegie Library and went ahead and built the library, and towns which were eligible for the grant, but for one reason or another didn't take up the grant. So you have a nice comparison between two sets of towns which are similar in lots of ways. They've the same average income, similar demographic profiles, but which differ in this key respect, which is that one set of towns built a library and the other set didn't. And what they show is that in that period in the early 20th century, rates of patenting, which they use as a proxy for innovation, were 8 to 13% higher in those towns with a library relative to those towns without. And when they dig down into why they think that might be the case, it's obviously part of the reason is that libraries give entrepreneurs and innovators and inventors access to knowledge and to technical manuals and to scientific journals and so on. But also crucially, they acted as social and collaborative spaces where talented individuals could come together, think creatively and collaborate on innovative projects. So historically, we've seen that relationship between libraries and local rates of innovation, and it continues today. And one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize with this report, looking at the role libraries play with respect to innovation and skills in the contemporary economy, is the way in which libraries complement formal education as providers of skills programs. I love that quote from Ian at the beginning about libraries being the universities of the street, and I definitely think our research bears that out. We actually draw on some of the resources from Libraries Connected to discuss the role of libraries in providing things like STEM and coding clubs or family literacy classes or art clubs or CV workshops. Those kinds of programs, in addition to the core offer of libraries, are absolutely crucial, particularly in some of the so-called left behind parts of the country, and particularly for young people and indeed for adults that might not have access to similar resources in the home. And so again, libraries, as well as, I mean, it's not just libraries, art galleries, theatres, they all have these kinds of skills programs, but I think libraries kind of lead the market in this particular domain, are adding to the economic prosperity of towns in a way that we think has probably been slightly unheralded and underappreciated in the past. So that's the economic value. The second type of value we look at is what we call its social value. And I'll just touch briefly on this. One of the really interesting findings here has to do with community resilience and health. So we show that towns which have lots of social infrastructure tend to be more resilient during times of crisis. And the way that we show that is to look at the number of mutual aid groups, kind of groups of neighbours and volunteers that popped up during the pandemic to deliver food parcels or to pick up prescriptions for neighbours and that sort of thing. The number of mutual aid groups per town was higher in towns that had more social infrastructure. And given that so much of the social infrastructure was shut during the pandemic, what that appears to suggest, at least to my mind, is that social infrastructure, places like libraries, are vital during regular periods for sustaining both formal and informal networks of support in a community, which can then be mobilized at times of crisis like a pandemic. So when the government is thinking in the future about, or when we're advocating to government in the future about the value of these kinds of social facilities, yes, we can talk about employment and skills and high streets, but it's also vital in the current context, given the current zeitgeist around the need for better resilience planning, to focus on the role that these kinds of facilities play in shoring up the resilience of communities. And obviously one of the key pillars of community resilience is public health. And we cite a whole plethora of research which shows that places that are richer in social infrastructure have lower rates of depression, anxiety, and stress. They have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of coronary heart disease, lower rates of premature mortality. And interestingly, but not that surprisingly, they have lower rates of loneliness and isolation, particularly among over 65s. So we have a nice plot in our report which shows that the risk of loneliness in people aged over 65s is lower in local authorities that have lots of facilities like libraries and leisure centres and town halls and so on. And finally, we touch on, I think this is probably one of the slightly more original parts of our report. We focus on the kind of the civic value of social infrastructure, its role in helping to create and nurture a sense of belonging and a sense of identity and pride in a local place. And so there's some evidence from France, for example, which shows that when a town loses the last remaining supermarket, or when there's a school closure or a GP surgery closes, rates of political disaffection, which is measured as in this particular study as participation in the Yellow Vests protests, increases. Abstention from presidential elections increases, and rates of self-reported well-being decline. On the other hand, when these spaces are well maintained, when they're safe, when they're properly resourced, we find that they can help to nurture feelings of strong and inclusive local identities and a sense of belonging. And there's also some evidence to show that rates of participation in local elections and in homeowners associations and community organizations is higher in places where those groups have the physical spaces to meet and sustain themselves. So social infrastructure, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but social infrastructure is valuable. We think it deserves more attention, particularly within the context of levelling up, and it deserves more funding. It's not just that the data bears out the value of these kinds of facilities. These facilities and investment in them is popular at the electoral level, which is, I think, a crucial point to finish with. There's several studies now which show that investing in meeting places, in youth services, in libraries, in playgrounds, is often a first order concern for local communities. And it's often a priority for those communities, particularly in so-called left behind places, above and beyond investment in physical infrastructure and transport projects. So going back to my original point that there's an ingrained tendency in government to think of levelling up and tackling spatial inequalities in terms of investing in physical infrastructure, there does currently appear to be a discrepancy between the way that the government prefers to think about levelling up and the priorities of communities themselves. And if social infrastructure over the next few years comes to feature more prominently in debates about levelling up, that will indicate that the government is serious about designing levelling up in a way that genuinely resonates with the priorities of local communities. If, on the other hand, the levelling up agenda continues to pivot predominantly around questions of physical infrastructure, that discrepancy between the preferences of communities and the priorities of government is likely to go unresolved. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating, Tom. Thank you. I'm taking over from Isabel in hosting it for the moment. She's nipped off to go to another meeting. Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating, particularly in the library sector, which I'm relatively new to. We're not very good at being able to articulate or evaluate the value that we provide. We know it's huge, we know it, but we don't quite know how to articulate it, and we don't quite know how to measure it as well. So I think your report is a really good step for us to be able to kind of take some of that forward. And I think particularly around levelling up, one thing that really jumps out is the whole thing about community resilience and social value, because obviously if we get to December and COVID's no longer a major issue, then next year, it's not like that's finished. There's going to be lots of, it's like the main earthquakes happen, but there's going to be lots and lots of little regional, local aftershocks, such as, I don't know, a steel plant closing in Middlesbrough or something like that. That will happen. And it feels as though maintaining those libraries and getting them reopened, getting them active community spaces again, is kind of really critical, and making sure we don't lose any of them in the process as well. So it feels like that level of kind of sustainable resilience on a local level is going to be absolutely critical as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think in the report, when we discuss resilience, we define it as the ability to withstand, respond to, and recover from exogenous shocks like a pandemic. And obviously that's a long process. Resilience isn't a snap in time. And so the need for communities to build up their resilience even after the pandemic is ostensibly finished, it is vital. And it's also, you know, it would be a crying shame if the lessons we've learned about resilience don't last particularly long, because there are other crises coming, particularly around, you know, the need to green the economy is going to create disruption that more resilient communities are going to find it easier to respond to. There are other crises coming down the road, and these kinds of facilities will be vital for those as well. I just finished by saying, if anybody's interested more in some of the academic work around resilience, I strongly encourage people to look up some of the work from the 90s by Eric Kleinenberg that looked at the role of places like libraries in helping neighborhoods in Chicago to respond to a heat wave there. He's got some fascinating data on how survival rates were higher in places that had really rich social infrastructure.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you, Tom. We'll hear from you with the questions in a minute, but first of all, we've got Sam Elliott, who's going to be talking about what her library service in Bolton is doing to meet the changing needs and of the high street there. Oh, I think you're still muted, Sam.
Thanks, Ian. I was just saying thank you. I'm Sam. I'm the head of service for libraries and museums and culture in Bolton. And I'm just going to talk about some of the practical things that we're doing in response to what the two speakers here today have talked about. So it might be useful practical tips for other heads of service and people interested in town centres and high streets on the call. So yeah, Bolton, head of service from Bolton, and you'll all know the name Bolton because we've been in the news quite a lot recently because of our situation with COVID. We've had a pretty rough ride over the past year, and actually we've probably spent more time in lockdown than any other place possibly, with the exception of Leicester. So we've been hit really hard by it. But whilst this has been happening, Bolton has also received lots of funding, and there's been lots of development work around our big town centre, so Bolton town centre, but also the townships within the borough. So Bolton has 4 townships. They're quite big for the size of places, and they all either have a high street or what I would class as a small town centre, but actually after listening to Dave, they probably are multiple high streets in one space. Each of those high streets or small town centres, we have a library either on the high street in the town centre or very, very close. I very much feel, you know, listening to Tom has been really great because actually I think libraries offer some fantastic stability where everything else is in a state of flux and much change. And I am preaching to the converted, but we know that they drive huge amounts of footfall into these places, and they are a great asset to support cultural activity. And I think that's traditionally been as hosting cultural activity, but more and more recently we've been delivering that cultural activity, and I think that's a massive area of growth in the future. We're very trusted as spaces. We do kind of instill that civic pride. And for us in Bolton, it's not me, I can't take the credit, but my colleague Emma, who's on the call today as well, she sits on the steering groups for each of these township places. So we're very much at the heart of these places and very much at the centre of how they are being developed. It's just to mention as well that one of these townships, Farnworth, has received Future High Streets funding, so there's a lot of emphasis on that place at the moment. But there are lots of other pots of money dotted across these 4 townships, and they are attracting more and more development. So I also chair the cultural leadership group in Bolton, and we also have a role to play alongside those steering groups in how those townships, how those high streets, town centres grow and develop, and culture is just becoming a much bigger part of that, libraries included. So I just wanted to talk about the practical things that we've done in response to what Tom and Dave has been talking about today. So, I mean, unfortunately, as always, and everyone will have experience of this on the call, that we're doing this as part of a service review. We are ultimately saving money, but at the same time, we're trying to align our structure to better meet the needs of these high streets and townships in the future. So yes, we have our flagship building, and that's a completely different animal to these high streets and townships. And so in the future, we've separated our staff to work in clusters. Now, clusters are not revolutionary. You know, a lot of libraries work this way, but our clusters are split into tier 1 and tier 2 libraries, and our tier 1 libraries are the high street or small town township libraries. And so what we've done, we've taken the decision to actually move more of our resource, our staff, into these areas where they are high streets and small town centres. because we know that actually with the amount of money that's being pumped into them at the moment, with the partnership development, this is where the action is at the moment, and this is where we think we can develop these areas at the moment. I mean, Isabel talked at the beginning about how the high street's changing, and I think that as heads of service, we have the responsibility to be brave and make these changes as quickly as the high streets are changing. And this, for us, just in Bolton, this is what our new restructure is about. So, and I am happy to share the job descriptions, the staffing structures with the rest of the heads of service. But ultimately, what we've done is we've created a new team leader, a new management post, and that post is a dual post, so it will look after visitor experience and income generation, because I think the two go together very well. And I think when we talk about visitor experience, that's very much going back to what Tom was saying about those physical spaces, the social spaces. So where visitor experience at our central flagship building might be about getting the most people through the door as possible and it being an attraction, in those community venues it is more about the kind of social power that those spaces have, and to me that is a visitor attraction as well. And that will obviously have a ripple impact on those high streets and those small town centres. And that team leader, that manager, will also have a hybrid responsibility for bringing in income as well to us. So that could be through cultural activities, commissioning, hosting other services within those libraries. But it is that manager post is absolutely central to everything that we're going to do going forward. That post, the post it's replacing, was a post that was solely customer service, so it was quite a traditional post. And actually we see this as quite a brave step to have a rethink about this and do something very different and make it absolutely central to what we do. Then underneath that post there's a series of professional roles or development roles, and these are the people who are going to make those partnership links with all those people on the high street, town centres, communities. And that could be from the social element of things, the different groups and, all those things that are happening in communities, or it could be with shop owners, lots of different things, but partnership and development are at the heart of it. And then, as I say, under that, our frontline staff, our frontline management, there's going to be more resource in those township areas, those high street areas, than say in the smaller community areas. And I think that, I've said it before on other webinars, that we really have to have a good think, and this is where we think visitor experience comes into it, that going back to what Tom was saying about, how people have historically got their kind of innovation and inspiration from library spaces, and that is absolutely still fundamental. But we've been having the conversation in Bolton and looking at the data of book issues and so on, and really do think there are some big steps to take in terms of changing how our physical spaces look. So at the moment, like 90% of our spaces taken with books, but we know that book issues are going down. And actually, if people are using us for much more social spaces or meeting spaces, then actually that's how we have to reconfigure our space. So for us, all this is about a change of direction, particularly in those township and high street areas. So I have job descriptions, I have a new staffing structure if people are interested in seeing that. My recommendation would be that if there are steering groups in those areas, get on them, make yourself known, keep talking about it. I mean, Ian is absolutely right. We're not great at articulating what we do in those places, and for me, I think we've had the greatest success when we just keep talking about it all the time. Just keep talking about it, and make sure you're talking to the right people on those steering groups. And I think that, just to other heads of service, for me, it's if you agree with everything that's said today, and it's putting your money where your mouth is really, and sometimes creating a new structure, putting some resource behind it, making a commitment is the way to do it, and to show the people that need to be shown that you're serious about it. So yeah, I haven't got a presentation or anything. It was a bit of a last minute thing, but I hope that's been useful. And if people are interested in the job descriptions or the structures, or want to have a call, myself or Emma, actually, who I work with, we'd be very happy to talk about it. So thank you very much.
That was fantastic, Sam, and thank you again. Sam didn't know she was doing this presentation until yesterday afternoon, so thank you for stepping in at the last minute. For anyone who wants to hear a bit more about Sam's journey and Bolton's journey as well, Sam did an excellent webinar a few weeks ago about the Levelling Up agenda and the Levelling Up Fund, which is available on the Income Generation Network. But yes, thank you again, Sam. Does anyone have any questions? Or I have one to kick it off with, if that be. Because I was just thinking, as we were kind of going through that, particularly Sam essentially is saying we're in a position where we can be brave and respond. I think really we have a responsibility to be brave and respond to these changes, and respond to these changes with, not with incremental change, but with some transformational change as well. And the work Tom's done is brilliant in terms of providing a platform for that and a justification for that as well. And one of the things that Dave's highlighted, and some of the stuff that we're conscious of as well, is that there are gaps in some of the evidence for it, which isn't to say we don't do it. It's not to say there are some gaps. I suppose that might help us, if we could fill them in, might help us to be able to make our case more effectively within our local authorities, within our library services, or in terms of when we're applying for larger funding. And I suppose the question is, what are those gaps for you? You three around the panel, but also everyone else in the discussion as well. What are the gaps, and how do we start to address those?
Will I take a stab at that? Because one of our recommendations, actually, which I didn't get time to go into, one of our recommendations is all about the need to improve the availability of data on social infrastructure, including on libraries. But when we set out to do the report, one of the things we wanted to do was to come up with some kind of composite measure of social infrastructure that would allow us to compare vision across places. And crucially, what we wanted to avoid doing, well, what we would have loved to have been able to do is measure not only the number of facilities in different places, the number of libraries, but something of their quality, something of, their accessibility, how well resourced they are. In the case of libraries, I think that maybe would look like Dave. I was clicking through some of Dave's work and found that there actually is data available on opening hours, which I would have loved to have known about that previously. But combining data on opening hours, opening on circulation rates, opening on staffing, data on staffing levels, that would allow us to look not just at which places have more libraries and which places have less, but which places are able to meet the needs of their communities to a greater or lesser extent, where is support needed. And also for social scientists like me that want to know what's the relationship between social infrastructure and other outcomes in the economy or in society, we need that kind of data. And when we were thinking this through, because what we ended up doing in the report was we used Ordnance Survey data as well, and we just count the number of facilities in different places, which is fine, but is quite a naive way of doing it. So we ended up coming up with a recommendation, which was for government to work with the ONS to develop something like an interactive data architecture that would allow users like me and like Dave and like libraries themselves to create bespoke tables by pulling together variables from across lots of different data sets. And those data sets ideally would be transformable from one geographical scale, like the local authority scale, to others, like the town scale, for example. And there are examples of existing data architectures like those that Statistics Scotland uses, which does allow for that kind of building of bespoke data. But there are challenges involved in terms of who would be collecting the data, managing some of the issues around confidentiality and privacy and so on. So at the Bennett Institute, we are in conversation with a couple of partners that are interested in trying to pilot things like that. So it would be, I'd love to hear, because we don't have any kind of particularly expert insight into the nature of data with respect to libraries specifically. So it would be fascinating to hear what others with a bit more expertise on that think the challenges there might be.
Brilliant. Dave, I'm sure you've got lots to say on that, but can I just bring Wayne in first and then I'll come back to you in a minute.
Thanks, Ian. I'm from Staffordshire County Council. I'm not a librarian by background. I'm a chartered civil engineer, and I'm led some projects to move libraries in Staffordshire to the centre of towns from the edge of town. So Lichfield Library 2 or 3 years ago, we moved into a defunct church right in Market Square, and we saw over the first year of trading after the move something like an 86% uplift in the number of people that came through our door. The number of loans that went up by 20%, the number of new memberships went up almost double, and that was moving into a smaller space but in the right place. We've just put in through the Stronger Towns Fund to do similar in a town not far from Lichfield, getting an absolute kicking about that at the moment, but we fundamentally think it's the right thing to do because we know we've got a footfall of 250,000 people a year that go into that library. We want to move that into the town centre rather than it being on the edge. We set out on that venture before COVID. I suppose my question, and it's a gut feel really from those here, is do you think you'll ever recover to the numbers that you had pre-COVID, or have you lost them to digital? Those for the panel members really, rather than the audience. And but if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free.
Sam, Dave?
I can answer with our viewpoint in Bolton, and we've been looking at our data. I'm not a data person. I would always recommend getting a good data person employed, and then someone who's very good at interpreting it and articulating it, because normally you don't get the same person who's great at both. But that would be my tip. But for me, if I'm being very honest, I don't think that book issues will recover to what they were. But I think there will be growth actually in lots of other areas. And that's why I think that actually have to forward think a little bit about this and try and preempt what's happening. And but no, I don't think book issues will recover, but happy to hear other opinions on that. But I do think from the data we're looking at in Bolton, there will be other areas that will definitely grow and could probably grow really highly, will exceed. That's my view.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think physical visits is the thing that we're really interested in terms of that footfall on the high street, rather than whether they take a book away at the end of it. It's using that space as a social space. So, I mean, it's been music to my ears listening to it. It's sort of been a bit cathartic as well, and helped me get back on the treadmill of running uphill against the tide at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's something as well about that phrase that we all use as well, about being lost to digital as well, and actually we need to kind of keep in mind that what we're not doing is losing people. We're transferring them to another element of our service, where we've still got an engagement with them. We're still providing a service to them, and actually I think people's engagement with libraries is multifactorial anyway. So it's like, even if people are engaged with digital, it might be that, I don't know, it shifted from they were 75% of their engagement was physical and 25% digital, and it shifted, but they've still got a level of physical and a level of digital engagement. And even if they've only got a digital engagement, then that's still a really valuable engagement in itself. We were looking at some figures, and the library engagement over the course of a 12-month period digitally, in terms of every kind of level of engagement that you might measure, so website hits and things like that, and Facebook pages. It's a big anything just thrown into the pot, but came out at about 250 million engagements over the course of a year for the UK library sector, which feels like there's a really strong base to start from there. Because of having those engagements, how do we then get some of those to then start to come back into the physical spaces and kind of see it as more of it's a shift into a different room, and we kind of encourage them to move around the different rooms rather than losing them to anything as well. But Dave, sorry, I didn't didn't go to you before, but I'll just come to you now.
No, that's quite all right. One thing I was going to mention that is part of the missing data conversation, but also kind of looking at whether membership or footfall or issues will recover, is that it's worth considering that's always been patchy in the past. So one thing I've been looking at recently is membership data and how library services can go from a kind of like extracting postcodes, for example, which we presume everyone can do on card membership, and trying to create a tool in which they can use their postcodes, keep them secure and anonymous, convert that into aggregated statistical information, and also get to the point where they can then browse that on a map to show areas of their authority, or even outside their authority, where they have, say, high membership or low membership, so relative to the population, and also look at things like deprivation and social indicators within those areas. A few library services have been trialing this, which is really good. So you literally just have to create a list of postcodes, put it into a tool, it converts it into a nice sort of open data format, and then displays it on a map. But it's really interesting because when you actually look at that data, you get sort of areas which have 50-60% membership and areas which have less than 5% membership. So we've always struggled in a way to engage everyone within the population. And it might be that some of those people are users of the library, but in a different way, not card membership users. But it's really, there's always been this kind of patchy membership where and opportunities for insight into who is a library member, who's not, who are we engaging with, just by kind of doing a bit more with data. And similarly, we never kind of like engage with our neighboring services. So if you have this kind of standard way of sharing data, you can start to see, okay, well, we've got this area which we're a bit concerned about. We've got less than 5% membership maybe, but actually we can discover that all those people are using the library which is in the neighboring service. And actually we don't really care that they're not particularly using our libraries. It doesn't matter too much. And that is actually the case. We looked at kind of Plymouth data, which was showing that actually there's a load of people within the Devon area which were using a particular Plymouth library. And that was just because it was, geographically more convenient for those people to use a library which is outside of their authority. But yeah, there's certainly a missing gap in doing a lot more with that data and sharing data between authorities in sort of standard ways. The other obvious thing I discovered was that where you have libraries, you have members. So you really get these peaks of membership precisely in the locations where you actually have libraries. So even within relatively urban areas, people very much make use of a library on their doorstep.
Yeah, and I suppose also if we had an approach where all this data was kind of available, so that what Wayne was saying before, those stats are just really kind of jump out, but it also jumps out the fact that we hear those stats in isolation in places like this, in discussions like this, but there's nowhere we can go to and think, right, we're thinking about doing this. How do we see how that's worked in different areas? How do we see, we think our town's comparable to that one. Can we see what they've done, what we learned from there? So it's that thing of not being able to join up those dots as well. And I mean, obviously Dave's a huge crusader for open data, and I'm an absolute supporter as well. But we're just not there yet as a sector, which is, I think, frustrating in many ways. But in many ways, we're just the fact that we're able to have these conversations and pick up some of that data, like from Staffordshire, is really helpful and a good step towards that. Sue has put in a comment in the chat. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Sue?
Hi, yeah. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey for us, because I think there was such an emphasis originally on the physical infrastructure that the county council was supporting, and there was a huge amount of resource directed into, I guess, one of the biggest issues, of course, in local government has been reducing your costs. So it was always looking at how we could review the estates the council was supporting and trying to make better use of it. But in doing that, they clearly looked at it as a purely physical solution rather than viewing it in terms of how customers or how service users could benefit from those sort of changes. And despite our best efforts, it was very difficult to get that message across, to turn that emphasis away from just purely a building-based solution to one that actually the service user could see the advantage of. which obviously, as I say there, it just sort of we ended up creating just the one hub because it proved very difficult to do. And those services have since all kind of moved away as well because of the way in which it was organised. It's only now, I think, since the pandemic has happened, have we managed to re-establish that conversation, but in a way that we originally hoped for, that it's now beginning to look at how some service transactions people might find more willing to engage with if they were in a setting that they felt more comfortable with. And so we are looking at, you're probably familiar with the NHS Health on the High Street initiative, and we're using that as a kind of launch pad to try and develop some of those connections. And it's quite exciting to see the NHS, social care, fostering, a whole range of public health services beginning to take an interest in how library spaces could support some of those transactions.
Yeah, and Tom, was there anything within your research that kind of sort of shed some light on those areas as well in terms of trying to integrate those different elements of broader state support, I suppose, but through kind of social infrastructure?
Yeah, so one of our key, one of the themes that sort of runs through our report is the idea that one of the unique values of social infrastructure is that it can provide something of an interface between state and citizen. And the words that stand out to me in Sue's comment in the chat is about libraries as being neutral and equitable spaces. And this is a point that Eric Kleinenberg, who's one of the kind of the seminal author on social infrastructure and has a huge passion for libraries, as I'm sure you probably already know. This is something he talks a lot about in his book, Palaces for the People. He talks about the value of libraries in providing spaces where people can be without being judged. And they're kind of, they're open to everybody. They're sort of universally accessible places, which makes them ideal places to house certain kinds of services. The only other thing I was going to say, actually, whilst I'm talking about Kleinenberg, was in response to Wayne's comment there about will footfall in libraries bounce back. The thing that the first thought I had when Wayne asked that question was, I mean, and again, I don't work in the library sector, so I'm not an expert, but I wonder whether that depends on what libraries offer in the future, and how kind of they change to meet variation and change over time in the demands that local people have. Kleinenberg has this wonderful anecdote about a Brooklyn library which offers a bowling league that's conducted using the Nintendo Wii gaming console for elderly people who are often too frail to hold a physical bowling ball but can hold a remote. And they come along and they're a member of a team at their local library, and they compete with other elderly residents in other neighborhoods. And it's this wonderful example of, I'd never imagined, like I've been to libraries all my life, I've never seen something like that in the ones I've been to, but kind of offering those kinds of innovative, technologically enhanced services might be a way of combating some of the trends towards people increasingly using online services and so on, in actually bringing people into a physical space. And I completely take Ian's point that like people using digital library services is still as valuable. But one of the points we try to make in the report is that there is something distinctive about socializing in a shared physical space, so for example, we deliberately exclude social media from our definition of social infrastructure because it doesn't appear, and this is sort of research-led, this view, but there is a sense in which the quality of social interactions, when we're talking about the value of social interactions, the quality of those interactions when they're orchestrated in physical space is slightly distinctive. And so whatever libraries can do to reinvigorate footfall in their physical sites, I think would be really, really welcome.
Yes, yeah. Any other comments, Sam or Dave, on that?
I mean, I would just go back to what I said previously, that I think things like that, like the Wii bowling and what we talked about earlier about the skills, skills and development. And I know I talk about it all the time, but we just have to make space. We have to make physical space for those things to happen. And so that's what we're doing, and that's what our new team leader will do. They'll be looking at what the visitor experience is and making that physical space. I think it's really important that we all look at that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. Sorry,
no,
Dave?
so I was just going to reiterate about physical space as well. I mean, one of the things that the kind of, I'd call it a report, but the blog post I wrote on libraries and high streets kind of iterated was that culture on the high street is still really important to people, having the difference to a retail location. One thing I tried to highlight all the way through was this difference between retail and high street, and retail and libraries, whatever you classify libraries as, whether it's culture, learning, leisure, whatever it might be. It's not retail, but it's got a really key position within this sort of retail environment, and that's really important, I think, to kind of maintain and to understand that it sits almost uncomfortably within this retail sector, but it kind of provides a good antidote almost to retail. When you're going around the high street, you can suddenly kind of go and sit in the library and have a kind of free experience for a period of time, and then maybe get back to shopping or whatever it is you're doing. And there's another report which the Arts Council did called Culture on the High Streets, which is a bit more about, in general, cultural institutions, which kind of had the same conclusions about kind of having museums and libraries all within touching distance of high streets, and how important that was.
Yeah, when Tom was talking, I'd kind of highlighted that thing that when you were talking about the research that was done over several years, or hundreds of decades, several decades, about libraries and innovation, and really highlighting the benefit of libraries as social and collaborative spaces, which then led to the growth of new companies, new organizations, new collaborations and things. And what I kind of pulled out from there was whether we have a question about, or is there a question about how libraries can do that more proactively? But as we're talking, it feels almost like we can't do that proactively. We just need to make the space for those things to happen. And it's almost like kind of the conference bar situation, or kind of a university bar kind of thing, where you've got all of those, you've got the people in the right place, and you can't force those interactions to happen. It's those interactions need to happen naturally once the space is provided to them. And that's kind of almost sort of like the core bit of that as well. But is there anything we could do more proactively to support that, do you think, to encourage and ignite those conversations, or is it something we just need to stand back from?
So I think you are right that a lot of the kind of the potential for places like libraries to drive rates of innovation plays out through informal mechanisms. It's just about bringing people together and providing people with a space and the resources to think creatively and collaboratively at the same time. But having said that, when I was writing the report and I came across Libraries Connected, some of your briefings and papers and things, one of the things that stood out to me, which I didn't know that libraries offered, was coding clubs. I think that's a fantastic example of how libraries can drive innovation, because up until 2 years ago, I couldn't write a single line of computer code, and I didn't know anything about it. And since when I did my master's, we were taught a little bit of how to code in order to do data analysis, and it's been absolutely transformative for my career as a researcher, and going forwards for increasing numbers of people. Those kinds of skills are going to be the sorts of skills that help to drive one of the things that helps to drive local innovation. And if libraries are involved in that and are creating a space in which students and young people that might not get on with that sort of thing at school can experiment with it in this kind of safe, non-judgmental environment, I think that's a brilliant example of the sorts of things that libraries can be doing in that space. But otherwise, yeah, just creating physical spaces for people to come together and think together and collaborate is vital. The fact that so much of that process plays out informally is part of the reason why capturing the value of libraries is so difficult. But it doesn't mean that we can't theorize about it, and it doesn't mean that in our lived experiences of using and managing libraries, those kinds of values aren't just obvious to us.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We've already run over slightly, but Sam and Dave, do you have any final comments as well, just to...
One I was just going to make is similar to that, and the coding club's kind of angle is that a number of years ago I was very heavily involved in a group called Bath Hacked, who were a community interest group in Bath, who kind of took open data that the local authority was releasing and did what they'd probably say was really cool things with it, but which was basically kind of really interesting projects about the civic infrastructure and about the kind of local area. So really engaged with things like, it might be noise complaints, or it might be car parking, or one really positive project was actually mapping and kind of making sure that every public location, including shops in Bath, had full accessibility information on a public map, so that wheelchair users could use an app to kind of see whether there was step-free access, whether or not there was accessible toilets in any public location. That was all done through a kind of community, crowdsourcing, community spirit, people being interested in the data in their local area. I don't think libraries have really tapped into those communities, because they do exist all over the UK. There's Manchester Open Data Group. There's communities everywhere who are doing these kind of things, but they're sort of sitting outside of library service. Whereas library services, this is kind of their bread and butter to some extent. Local information, local data. And I really think there's a kind of, the code groups are great, but they're kind of normally for a kind of maybe younger age group. I think there's a really positive opportunity for open data and just general local information about area for libraries to get involved in, and maybe host, as well as kind of obviously providing their own open data, but to host and kind of facilitate for.
Brilliant, thank you. And Sam?
I mean, I was just going to mention one example in Bolton. So as part of the big capital project, we've really thought about how a certain group of people who don't use us at the moment, which is students, how they can stay with us for like the next 5 years or so. So we thought about it, and as part of our making space for people, we're going to create some studio space for them. So we have a fantastic special effects and arts department in Bolton, but they all go all over the world, and they leave Bolton. So we're hoping that they stay with us, use our studio spaces, which we'll give for free, but in return they will sell their items, that what they make in our shop, and they will deliver our cultural programme for us. So it's about actually, how do we think about the next 5 years or so? So it's just an example of how we make space.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example to finish on as well, I think, Sam. So can I just say a big thank you to Tom, Dave and Sam. Been an absolutely fantastic panel, and a big thank you to everyone else who's joined as well, and thank you to Isabel as well. Big thank you to everyone else who's joined, and apologies for going a few minutes over, but I'm sure it's absolutely been worth it. The recording will be available on the Income Generation Network, and we'll make it so that you can then share it round other people outside that network if you want to, plus also the links to Tom's paper, Dave's work, and we'll put a link to Bolton Libraries and Museums as well, because it's always worth going have a look at that. So thank you again, and thank you to the Arts Council who sponsored this as well.